The morning had come on slowly, the way autumn mornings do in Wiltshire. The mist not burning off so much as thinning by degrees until the hedgerows emerged grey-green and wet against a sky the color of old pewter. Dorothea arrived at St. Hay, Ambrose Church at 9:30, which was precisely the hour written in the letter she had carried inside her coat pocket for 6 months, the paper soft now at its folds from so much handling. She had traveled by hired carriage from her cousin's house in the village, wearing the gown she had carefully brushed the night before, the pale cream one with the narrow green sash she had retrimmed herself in the spring because the old ribbon had frayed. Her gloves were new. She had spent more than she should have on the gloves, and she was aware of this, and she did not regret it. She stepped down from the carriage and stood for a moment in the lane, looking at the church the way one looks at a thing one has imagined so many times, that seeing it plainly seems both too much and not quite enough. Then she saw the second carriage. It stood ahead of hers along the churchyard wall, a private equipage of the kind that spoke of real money, the horses matched, the harness polished to a degree that caught even the thin morning light. A footman in livery stood at attention. Another footman was in the process of arranging something white at the church door, something that required careful handling, something that resolved itself, as Dorothea approached, into a wedding veil being lifted free of the door's iron hinge where it had snagged. Dorothea stopped walking. Inside the vestibule, visible through the old wavy glass of the side window, a woman stood being arranged by a woman older than herself. The younger woman was perhaps 22, her gown white as paper, her hair dressed high and threaded through with small white flowers. A mother, clearly. A daughter, clearly. A bride. The verger moved past the glass and his voice reached Dorothea faintly through the old stone walls. Only 2 words audible in the morning quiet. "Miss Moorcroft," he said. Dorothea stood in the churchyard with the wet grass against her shoes and understood that she was looking at another bride, at the same hour, in the same church, for the same ceremony she had believed was hers. She did not run. She did not make a sound. She reached into her coat pocket, and she took out the letter, and she held it, and she stood where she was, because her legs had made the decision for her, before her mind had properly arrived at the fact of what she was seeing. If you had found her there in that moment, a slight woman in a retrimmed gown, alone in a churchyard, holding a folded letter the way one holds a thing one cannot set down, you might have taken her, as Gerald Ashby had once described her, for the sort of woman nobody particularly notices. A quiet, forgettable country girl. The room had been wrong about her before. It was wrong about her now. 6 months earlier, the world had looked entirely different. Her father had died in March, which was the first blow, and the estate had been small enough that there was no estate to speak of after, which was the second, and her uncle in Surrey had died in June without naming her in his will, which was the third. By August, Dorothea had arrived at the precise condition the season assigned women of her circumstances without particular unkindness. She was simply without a home, without an income sufficient to maintain one, without the sort of connection that produces invitations to the gatherings where one is seen. She had been managing the household accounts for the Ashby estate in a neighboring parish since spring, a position arranged by the vicar who had buried her father, because she was capable, and because she needed the income, and because Mrs. Peel, the Ashby housekeeper, had vouched for her character. Gerald Ashby was 31 years old, and in possession of a modest estate and a reasonable income, and the sort of easy, warm manner that made him pleasant company without making him anything more. He had paid her attention across several weeks in small and deniable ways, stopping to speak with her when he encountered her in the corridor, asking her opinion on matters that were manifestly not part of her duties, bringing her a glass of sherry one evening when she had worked late at the ledgers and telling her with what had seemed like real feeling that she was too clever for the work she was doing and that he hoped she knew it. She had sat with that sentence for several days. She was not accustomed to being told she was clever, in a voice that expected nothing from her in return. He had proposed to her on an afternoon in late September, in the kitchen garden, while she was coming from the still room with the inventory she had just completed. He had been direct and warm, and she had said yes before he had finished the sentence, which embarrassed her slightly when she thought of it afterward, because she had always supposed she would manage these moments with more composure. He had asked her to say nothing for a while the arrangements were being made, while he spoke to certain parties. She had agreed because she trusted him. He had sent her the letter 3 weeks later, naming the date and the church and the hour, and she had carried the letter in her coat pocket every day since. What she had not known, because he had taken care that she should not know, was that he had been simultaneously engaged in a correspondence of an entirely different kind with Lavinia Moorcroft, the eldest daughter of Sir Francis Moorcroft, whose fortune was both larger and more certain than any inheritance Gerald had imagined might come to Dorothea. The formal announcement of the engagement between Gerald and Miss Lavinia Moorcroft had appeared in the county paper 6 weeks before the wedding date. Dorothea's cousin had mentioned it in passing one morning at breakfast, reading from the paper without particular emphasis, and Dorothea had sat very still and said nothing, because the date in the announcement was not the date in her letter, and she had told herself there must be some confusion, some misprinting, something that would resolve itself when she spoke to Gerald. She had not spoken to Gerald. She had carried the letter. She had come on the morning he had named. She was in the churchyard now, holding the letter, and she was not confused any longer. If you are still with Dorothea in this moment, stay close. What comes next requires witnesses. Captain Edmund Fairley arrived at St. Sign, Ambrose Church, at 20 minutes before 10 in the duty-bound manner of a man who has been a soldier and retains the habit of being early to every occasion he has agreed to, which is to say, a little grimly, and without the pleasure that punctuality might theoretically provide. He was Gerald's oldest friend, and he had agreed to stand for him at the wedding in the way that men of long acquaintance agree to things before they have examined what they are agreeing to. He had served in the Navy for 9 years and returned to England 11 months earlier, which had not been long enough to fully recall how much he disliked the kinds of situations that required standing in a church in one's best coat, while one's friend made promises of the legally binding variety. He was 33, with the lean, spare build of a man who had spent the better part of a decade at sea, and his face was angular and weathered and not given to displays of anything he had not decided to display, which was most things. He came through the churchyard gate, and he saw Dorothea standing among the gravestones with a letter in her hand, and he stopped. He had met her twice, briefly, at the Ashby estate, on his visits home the previous autumn. He remembered her because she had answered a question of his directly and without flattery, which had been unusual in that household, and because Gerald had spoken of her afterward in the carriage with an ease that had made Edmund uneasy in a way he had not examined at the time. She was a quiet, forgettable country girl, Gerald had said, meaning it as the kind of benign dismissal that requires no response. Edmund had given no response. He had made note of the manner in which Gerald had said it, not with contempt, but with the particular lightness of a man who is managing the information he provides about a woman, and had set the note aside. He had stopped setting it aside 3 weeks ago, when a letter from Gerald had mentioned, in a postscript, that the Moorcroft match was confirmed and the date was set, and he hoped Edmund would not find it too awkward, given that Dorothea had been rather led to expect something. Rather led to expect. Edmund had read the postscript 3 times, and then had stood at his window for a long time looking at the street below, and trying to determine what, precisely, he owed Gerald after 20 years of friendship, and whether the question of what he owed was the correct question. He had concluded, in the quiet privacy of his own conscience, that it was not the correct question. He had not written to Dorothea because he had not known how to begin such a letter, and because he had told himself it was not his place, and because he had been, in the honesty of that same private conscience, afraid. He looked at her now in the churchyard, and understood that his fear had cost her the 3 weeks it might have taken to prepare herself for what she was currently being required to absorb without preparation. He crossed the churchyard toward her. She watched him come with an expression that was neither welcoming nor unfriendly. It was simply observant, the expression of a woman who has decided that things are as they are, and that the next piece of information will be managed the way all the others have been managed. "You knew," she said, not unkindly. He did not insult her by denying it. 3 weeks ago, he said, I should have written. Yes, she said. You should have. She looked at the church. Is that Miss Moorcroft? I believe so. And her mother. Lady Moorcroft? Yes. Dorothea returned the letter to her coat pocket with a small, deliberate motion, pressing it flat against her side. I think, she said, that I should go inside. Edmund said nothing. He opened the churchyard gate for her, and she walked through it. And he followed, because there was nothing else to do. And because he had abdicated a responsibility once already this morning, and he had no intention of doing it again. The vestry of St. Shista. Ambrose was a small stone room that smelled of damp wool and beeswax candles, and in it, approximately 1/4 of an hour after Dorothea entered the church, 2 women stood facing each other across a narrow table in the way that women face each other, when the situation has stripped away all the usual procedures for such encounters. Doth the situation itself. Lavinia was younger than Dorothea and taller, and her gown was everything that Dorothea's was not, which is to say white and new and expensive in the specific way that speaks of a father, who has not counted the cost. She had kind eyes. Dorothea noticed this first, because she had been prepared in the carriage ride to the church that morning to dislike the younger woman quite thoroughly, and she found that she could not manage it when confronted with the actual eyes. The verger had brought them together with the panicked diplomacy of a man who has encountered a situation his ordination did not prepare him for. He had produced from somewhere in his distress a glass of water for each of them that neither of them drank. Dorothea placed her letter on the table. It was folded twice, the paper soft at the creases, the handwriting on the outside. Gerald's Lavinia looked at it. He wrote to my father. Formally, Lavinia said, her voice steady. My father received his letter in June. There was a notice in the county paper in September. She paused. He told me he had never made any other offer. He proposed to me in September of last year, Dorothea said. In the kitchen garden at Ashby Hall there was a witness. She did not know yet whether Mrs. Peel would be called upon, but the fact of it sat quietly in her, a small reserve she did not intend to spend before she understood the terrain. Your mother has arrived? She is in the nave, Lavinia said. She will be here directly. She was. Lady Moorcroft entered the vestry in the manner of a woman who has arranged this particular morning across 6 months of careful and deliberate effort, and who regards whatever is currently occurring as a delay she has not authorized. She was a handsome woman of 56, with the kind of confidence that comes from never having had serious cause to doubt herself. She was wearing a very fine gray silk, and her diamonds at the throat, and she looked at Dorothea the way one looks at a letter that has arrived at the wrong address. Whatever this girl claims, her ladyship said without addressing Dorothea directly, she is a nobody from nowhere, who has managed to cause a scene on the most important morning of my daughter's life. She turned to the verger. Find Mr. Ashby. Gerald arrived in the vestry at 14 minutes before 10. He was dressed for his wedding, which is to say he was dressed for the wedding he had arranged with Lavinia, and when he saw Dorothea, the color left his face in the specific way it leaves the face of a man who has arranged 2 things and arrived at the moment when the arrangement has met its own impossibility. He recovered quickly. She had to grant him that. He spoke warmly, and with a kind of patient concern that she recognized, because it was the same voice he had used in the kitchen garden and in the corridor of Ashby Hall and on a dozen other occasions when he had been managing something while appearing to be simply present. Unquote. He produced, within the first 2 minutes, 3 separate explanations for the letter she held, each one slightly more elaborate than the last. A misunderstanding first. Delivered in the warm, regretful tone of a man confronted with an unfortunate confusion he wishes he might have prevented. A casual expression of regard. Second, which required him to reframe the kitchen garden and the inventory, and the quality of the September afternoon as something other than what they had been. A letter written in a moment of feeling that should not have been sent. Third, which was the most careful of the 3, because it did not deny the letter's existence, but placed its meaning outside the law of ordinary promises in the country of private sentiment, where nothing could be held against you. Dorothea listened to all three without interrupting, because she wanted to hear what he would choose when he had run through his options. And also because she was aware of Lavinia standing at the edge of the room, with the expression of a woman who was also listening and filing each thing away. She asked him a single question when he had finished. "Did you ever intend to marry me?" The vestry was very quiet. The candle on the small table near the door hissed once in some draught, and then settled. Gerald opened his mouth. He closed it. He produced a fourth explanation that began with her name and ended without a subject, which is to say it was not an answer. She already had her answer. Edmund had been standing against the wall during this exchange in the particular stillness of a man who has decided to remain still, because the alternative is to do something for which he has not yet prepared a defense. He was aware of the gathered guests at the doorway, their faces arranged in the careful expression people produce when they wish to convey that they are not enjoying a scene they are manifestly enjoying. He watched Dorothea hear Gerald's non-answer and receive it into herself, with a composure so complete that it looked from a certain distance like absence. It was not absence. He understood that. He had watched his sister Grace in a room not entirely unlike this one, 4 years ago, when the man Edmund had introduced her to had produced a not dissimilar non-answer for a not dissimilar question. Grace had wept. She had made noise. She had broken things and was broken in turn, and the room had absorbed this in the way rooms absorb such things, which is to say, with judgment. Dorothea was doing something else. She was standing with her hands at her sides, and her chin level and her expression one of such precise, contained attention that Edmund understood she was doing what she always did, which was thinking. She was looking at Gerald and thinking about what she saw, and she was not performing anything at all. Not grief, not indignation, not the collapsed display that the room might have managed to forgive or dismiss or explain away. She was simply present and looking and thinking. And that was more than Gerald could withstand. He had looked away from her twice already. Edmund thought about his sister. He thought about 3 weeks ago, and the letter and the postscript. He thought about the note he had made, and set aside, in a carriage, 12 months ago when Gerald had said, "She is a quiet, forgettable country girl," and meant it as dismissal, and Edmund had let it pass unchallenged. He put down his gloves on the vestry table and he walked quietly out of the vestry and down the short stone corridor and out the side door into the churchyard, turning toward the lane that led to Ashby Hall, where the housekeeper had been in service for 31 years, and had a memory precise as a court record, and knew exactly what she had witnessed in the kitchen garden last September. The dark moment did not announce itself. It came in the way the worst moments often do, wearing the face of procedure. Her ladyship, having had sufficient time to assess the situation and determine the most efficient path through it, called upon the assembled guests who had been waiting in the nave. They filed into the morning room adjacent to the vestry, and several of them crowded the doorway to hear. And Gerald was given the space and the audience he required to produce what he had clearly been working toward since he had first entered the vestry, and found Dorothea standing at the table. He stood before them, and he told the story of a woman who had mistaken a gentleman's courtesy for an offer. He told it gently, which made it worse. He spoke of Dorothea's situation, which he named, carefully and at length: her father's death, the lost income, the position in his household, the vulnerability of her circumstances. He said that he had felt a compassionate warmth toward her, that she had, in her loneliness, elevated to something it was never meant to be. He said she had produced a letter that she had asked him to write for quite different purposes, a household matter he could not now recall precisely. The guests listened. They were perhaps 30 in number, mostly county families, people who knew the Ashbys and the Moorcrofts, and did not know Dorothea at all, or knew her only as the late vicar's daughter who had been managing someone's accounts. Her ladyship watched from her position near the window, with the stillness of a woman who has seen the field secured. "She is a quiet, forgettable country girl," Gerald said, and his voice was still gentle, still carrying the particular warmth he deployed so easily, who convinced herself that a gentleman's courtesy was a proposal. "I am grieved that she has suffered a misapprehension. I cannot, however, permit her misapprehension to stand as fact before this company. The room was very still. Lavinia was looking at Gerald with an expression Dorothea could not entirely read from where she stood. Dorothea picked up her letter from the table where she had laid it. She held it. She was not going to argue. She was not going to weep. She was not going to do any of the things that would make his story easier to believe. She thought about the 23rd of September and the kitchen garden, and the quality of the light that afternoon, and the inventory she had been carrying under her arm. And she thought about the sherry he had brought her, and the sentence about cleverness. And she understood now what each of those things had cost him, and what each of them had earned him in return, which was her trust, which he had spent without informing her of the expenditure. "She is to be removed," her ladyship said to the verger, as if Dorothea were an item of furniture that had been mistakenly delivered. Dorothea turned toward the door. She heard it open before she reached it. Edmund came through the church door with she beside him. The woman was 60 years old and had been housekeeper at Ashby Hall since before Gerald could walk, and she had the comfortable, unassailable manner of a woman who has spent her life in service to one household and long since stopped being afraid of anything it might produce. She wore her Sunday dress. She had her hands folded in front of her. She looked at the room, and she looked at Dorothea, and she nodded once, briefly, in the way of a woman who knows exactly why she has been fetched. Edmund stepped into the center of the room, and he spoke clearly, in the quiet voice of a man who has learned that volume is not authority. He asked she to confirm what she had witnessed in the kitchen garden at Ashby Hall on the 23rd of September in the previous year. The housekeeper confirmed it. She had been cutting back the lavender along the south wall and had witnessed Mr. Ashby make a formal offer of marriage to Miss Dorothea, giving her Christian name precisely. She had heard his words. She had heard Dorothea's answer. She had noted the date in her household diary that same evening, because she was precise about such things, and the diary was at home on the kitchen shelf if anyone wished to consult it. She offered this last information without particular emphasis, in the tone of a woman for whom accuracy has always been a form of housekeeping. Gerald said that she's recollection was naturally subject to the uncertainties of time, and that he did not doubt she believed what she said. Miss Crane was here first, Edmund said. The room went still in a different way than it had been still before. She was always here first. Then he went to the vestry table and produced from inside his coat a small leather-bound household ledger. It was the Ashby Hall accounts ledger for the previous autumn. The entries in Dorothea's precise and careful hand. He opened it to the page for the 23rd of September, and he read aloud the entry she had made that afternoon, in which she had noted her completion of the quarterly inventory, and the time at which she had finished, and a brief note to herself at the foot of the column. Accounts submitted, arrangement confirmed. Gerald had not known she would write it down. She had not done it for this purpose. She had done it because she was methodical, and because writing things down had always been the way she held on to the things that mattered, in the way of a woman who had grown up with very little that could not be taken. Gerald looked at the ledger. Then he looked at Edmund. Then he looked at the room. He did not speak again. Lavinia was the first to move. She turned to her mother and she said, in a voice that was very calm and very final, that she had no intention of marrying a man whose word had this particular quality, and that she would be grateful for her father's carriage, and that they should go home. Her ladyship said several things in rapid succession. The first formal and firm, and the last two somewhat less so. Her composure developing a very fine crack along the surface that was visible if one was watching carefully, and several people in the room were watching carefully now. None of it changed Lavinia's expression. The wedding did not proceed. Gerald departed in his own carriage before 10 o'clock, not looking at anyone as he went through the church door. Her ladyship departed at 10:05 with Lavinia, and what passed between them in that carriage was not witnessed by anyone at St. Tree. Ambrose Church and the county would form its own theories in due time. The guests began to separate themselves from the moment in the way guests separate themselves from moments they have witnessed but cannot claim. Small movements. Turned shoulders. A woman finding her gloves. A man recollecting an errand. The verger, who had survived the morning with more credit than most, disappeared quietly into the vestibule. She came to stand beside Dorothea, with the calm permanence of a woman who has decided where she is standing and will stand there until things are resolved. Lavinia came to Dorothea just before she left, in the doorway of the church. She was still in her wedding gown, which gave the moment a particular quality that Dorothea could not quite name. "I am sorry," Lavinia said, "for what he did to you, and for what it cost you to come here today." "I am not sorry for coming," Dorothea said, and found that she meant it, in the specific way one means an unexpected truth that has arrived too suddenly to be managed into something more palatable. "It is better to know." Lavinia looked at her for a moment. The morning light was full now, coming through the church door and falling between them on the stone floor. "Yes," Lavinia said quietly. "I think it is." She turned to go. She paused. "The gloves," she said. "They are very fine." Dorothea looked down at her hands. "I spent too much on them," she said. "No," Lavinia said. "You spent exactly right." She went. The carriage rolled. The lane was quiet. The church was empty, except for Dorothea and Edmund and she. The candles on the altar were still lit, very still in the quiet air, and the morning light came through the old wavy glass of the windows and lay across the stone floor in long pale rectangles. Edmund said, "Do you have somewhere to go?" "My cousin," Dorothea said in Bath. "Good." He was quiet. She was quiet. She had withdrawn to the vestibule with the tact of a woman who has been managing awkward domestic situations for 30 years and understands the value of a discreet distance. "I knew," Edmund said again, 3 weeks ago. "I did not write." "No," Dorothea agreed. "I told myself it was not my place." "Did you believe that?" A pause, and in the pause the candle on the side table hissed once, "No." She considered him. He was standing in the morning light with his hat in his hands, which was not the posture of a man who thought well of himself at present, and she found that this did not make her less angry with him and also paradoxically did not make her like him less. He had come, he had brought she. He had stood in the room and said 12 words, and made them count, and she had watched him do it, and understood that the counting had cost him something. "You may write to me," she said, "in Bath, if you are of a mind to." He looked at her. "I cannot promise to answer quickly," she said. "I have a good deal to think about." "I understand," he said. He put his hat on. He held the church door for her, and she walked out into the October churchyard, and the mist had finally lifted entirely, and the morning was clear and pale and very still. She had somewhere to go. She had always had somewhere to go. 3 weeks passed in Bath, and then 4. And then the leaves in the parade gardens turned fully, and the evenings came earlier, and Dorothea established the rhythm of her cousin's house, which was quiet and kind, and gave her room to think. She thought about Gerald, who was the subject of considerable county discussion and somewhat less county sympathy than he had perhaps anticipated. She thought about the wedding gown she had not worn, and the kitchen garden, where a promise had been made, and the ledger entry she had written without knowing it would ever be needed. She thought sometimes about the sherry he had brought her, and the sentence about cleverness, which had been, she now understood, the most calculated of all the gestures, because it had been the truest, and truth is easier to believe than kindness. She thought about Edmund Fairley, who had written to her 3 times. The first letter was brief and formal, and covered one side of a single sheet, and said essentially that he hoped she had arrived safely, and that Bath suited her, and that he remained, as ever, her servant. It was the letter of a man who was not certain the correspondence had been genuinely invited, and was proceeding with caution. She did not answer it. The second letter was longer. He had written about his sister, whose name was Grace, and who now lived in Devonshire with a husband who was, Edmund said, the kind of man a woman deserves to have. He wrote about introducing Grace to the man who had preceded this husband, and about the winter that had followed Grace's abandonment, and about what it had cost him to stand in another vestry 4 years later, and do what he should have done before rather than after the damage. He did not ask for absolution. He did not explain himself beyond what the facts required. He said only that he had written, because he thought she might want to know why a man who knew how things stood had nevertheless waited 3 weeks to act. She did not answer this one either, but she read it twice, and then a third time, and placed it with some deliberateness in the drawer of her writing desk, in the place where she kept the things that required more thought than she had yet given them. The third letter arrived on a Tuesday, in the 3rd week of October. It was 3 sentences long. It said that he would be in Bath on the Friday of that week, visiting a friend in Pulteney Street, and that he did not wish to impose upon her time, but that he would take coffee at the pump room at 11 o'clock on the Saturday morning if she happened to find herself nearby. She did not answer this one at all. She put on her good gloves on Saturday morning and walked out. He was there when she arrived, standing near the windows with his hat in his hands, which he had begun to understand was the position he assumed when he was uncertain of his welcome. She crossed the room and he turned, and they stood looking at each other with the particular quality of attention that has accumulated across weeks of letters, and the memory of a churchyard and 12 words spoken at precisely the right moment. They took coffee, they talked for an hour, and then an hour more, and the conversation was not easy, because neither of them was the kind of person for whom ease was the primary value, but it was honest, which was its own kind of comfort. He told her about the Navy, about the years he had spent at sea and what they had made of him, and also what they had cost him, in terms of the ordinary texture of a life lived in one place among the same people. She told him about her father, and about the accounts, and about the specific quality of the loneliness of the past year, which she had not named aloud to anyone before, and which she named now with the precision she brought to most things. He listened in the way of a man for whom listening is active, not passive. He asked her one question that was not the obvious question, which was how she had managed to remain as clear-headed as she appeared to be on a morning that would have undone most people. She considered it. She said she thought it was because she had known, or almost known, since the morning she had read the announcement in the county paper, and that the knowing and the not knowing had occupied the same space in her for 6 weeks, and that seeing it plainly, however terrible, had in some sense been a relief. He had nodded. He had said that he understood that. She believed him. He came to her cousin's house that afternoon and was introduced to the cousin who was kind and curious in equal measure, and the cousin received him with the particular warmth of a woman who had spent several weeks worrying over Dorothea and was relieved to find the source of the recent letters sitting in her front parlor with reasonable manners and an honest face. He stayed for tea, and then for supper, which had not been the invitation, but had somehow become it, in the way that evenings become longer when the conversation has not exhausted itself and no one in the room particularly wants to be the first to name the hour. In the days that followed, he called again. And then, again. He brought her a book once, which he had thought she might like, and he was right, which she told him. And he received this information with the expression of a man filing it carefully away alongside the other things he was learning. On an evening in November, when the fire in her cousin's sitting room had burned low and the cousin had retired, and the candles had been mostly pinched out, and the room was warm and very quiet, Edmund sat across from Dorothea and asked whether she would permit him to continue calling. She did not answer immediately. Outside the window, the first rain of November was beginning, softening the paving stones of the street, and the room was warm, and she was aware of him with a precision that had grown familiar across the past weeks, in the way that certain things grow familiar because they are true, rather than because they are convenient. He was not a comfortable man. He was not easy, in the way Gerald had been easy. He was angular and careful and sometimes too quiet, and when he was uncertain he stood with his hat in his hands, and she had noticed each of these things with the attention she brought to accounts, which is to say she had noted them, and returned to them and trusted them. "I think," she said, "that I would not object to it." "That is not precisely encouragement," he said. "No," she agreed. "It is not precisely encouragement." She looked at her hands, the good gloves folded in her lap. "It is an accurate statement of my present position. I'm not a woman who speaks before I know what I mean to say." "I know," he said. "I have noticed." He had noticed. The thought settled into her chest with the warmth of something earned rather than given, and she understood, in the way of a woman who has learned to trust the body's quiet testimony over the mind's louder protests, that this was the particular kind of noticing she had not known she needed until she had it. She went to bed that night and lay in the quiet of the small room her cousin had given her, listening to the rain, and she thought about Gerald's letter and about Edmund's 3 letters which lived now side by side in the drawer of her writing desk, though not for the same reason. In the morning she opened the drawer and she took out Gerald's letter, the one she had carried in her coat pocket for 6 months, and she read it once more, which was the last time she would read it. And she folded it carefully, and she placed it at the back of the drawer behind the 3 letters that were still worth reading. Edmund's most recent card lay on the blotter. She set it on top of the writing desk where she could see it. The rain outside had stopped in the night and the morning was clear, the stone of the street, pale and clean and still wet from the night's work, the light coming through the window honest and sufficient. She sat down at the desk. She took out a fresh sheet. She dipped her pen. She had not yet answered his letters. She thought it was perhaps time that she did. She thought about what she would write and how she would begin. And then she stopped thinking about it and simply began, because she was not, when it came to it, the kind of woman who required a great deal of preparation for the things she had already decided to do. Thank you for staying with Dorothea today. If this story found you in a place where you needed it, leave a word below. It means something to know you were here.